Hello everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Now, close your eyes and listen closely to the alabaster dagger. Section 1. The unmarked parcel. It was in the waning light of an October evening that Holmes, who had spent the day in a meditative silence, suddenly rose from his armchair and crossed the room with sharp deliberation. A knock had sounded at the door of 221B, Baker Street. A gentle rapping, cautious but persistent. Mrs. Hudson opened the door to reveal a boy, no older than 12, holding a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. For Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the lad stammered. Left this morning at the Oxford station. Said it was to be delivered at once. Holmes took the parcel with a nod and shut the door briskly. Curious, he murmured, examining it. No postage, no sender's name, merely my own, in a fine copperplate hand. I leaned forward as he placed the parcel on the table and carefully slit the twine. Beneath the paper was a plain box. Inside it, nestled in velvet, lay a dagger. It was short, almost ceremonial in shape, its hilt carved from alabaster, and its blade glistening though unstained. What drew our attention most, however, was the note folded beneath it. Holmes read it aloud. Mr. Holmes, something sacred has been disturbed. The note was unsigned but for the initial. Holmes's brow furrowed. No address, no explanation, only a cryptic warning, and this, he said, holding the dagger up to the light. What do you make of it, Watson? I examined the weapon. A ritual blade, perhaps? The hilt is not ornamental, it bears symbols. Egyptian, maybe. Holmes nodded approvingly. Indeed. Carvings of Anubis and Horus. And see here, on the pommel, this was not crafted recently. Mid-dynasty work, at a guess. Stolen antiquity. Possibly. Or something far older than theft, a desecration. Holmes placed the dagger in his desk drawer, locked it, and took to pacing. Watson, I fear this is a summons in disguise. The sender is not some anonymous tipster, but a person known to me. The handwriting, though masked, bears traits of someone I've encountered before. And who might that be? He paused. Benedict Talbot. I blinked. The Egyptologist? The same man who vanished during the Abington dig 3 years ago. The very one, Holmes said. And if this dagger comes from him, or his estate, then something deeply buried has clawed its way to the surface. We took the first train to Oxfordshire the following morning. Holmes was unusually quiet during the journey, his hands steepled, his gaze distant. Upon arrival at the village of Abington, we were met by Reverend Cyril Vane, a mild, aging clergyman with watery blue eyes and a fumbling demeanor. Yes, yes, he said nervously as we were ushered into the manse. Dr. Talbot's house. It's still under probate, but there's been strange activity. Light seen at night. Footprints in the dust. And last week, someone broke into the church crypt. The crypt? Holmes asked, sharply. Yes, quite disturbing. No signs of theft, but the Talbot sarcophagus moved. The lid shifted. Talbot was buried here. Well, not entirely. After the expedition failed, they returned only with fragments. His walking stick. His gloves. They held a symbolic burial. Holmes's eyes lit with sudden interest. A symbolic burial, and now symbolic theft. What exactly did the expedition uncover before it disbanded? Vane hesitated. There was talk of a scroll. Ancient, possibly apocryphal. Said to predict the fall of kings. Dr. Talbot was obsessed with it. The press dismissed it as a hoax, but he believed. Did the dagger come from that same dig? I asked. The clergyman nodded. Almost certainly. The alabaster weapon, it was one of two. The other was lost. Holmes murmured, not lost, perhaps buried. We visited Talbot's old home that afternoon. The manor stood at the edge of a bog, shrouded in mist and ivy. A broken lantern swung from its porch. Holmes picked the lock with ease, and we stepped into dust and silence. Inside, the place bore the markings of both obsession and abandonment. Books on ancient rites, papyrus transcriptions, and sketches of burial chambers covered every surface. A journal, half filled, lay open on the desk. Holmes flipped through it. Listen to this, he said, reading aloud. October 9th. The dagger stirs again. I dream of red sand and chanting. The boy was right, the seal is broken. The boy? I asked. Holmes turned the page. Bennett claims to hear voices near the chapel. He fears they've returned. I have no doubt now the blade was meant to remain untouched. He looked up. Watson, who is Bennett? A search of the house led us to a back room that once served as a servant's quarters. There we found more scribbled notes, childish and frenzied. One, pinned to the wall, read, "The one with no tongue comes at night." Holmes turned to me, his expression grim. Someone has stirred something, or someone, from a long, uneasy slumber. That night, we stayed at the local inn. Holmes barely slept. He sat at the window, watching the road to the Talbot estate. Just before dawn, he roused me. "Watson," he whispered, "come see." Out the window, a figure moved down the lane. Cloaked, barefoot, with a slow, staggering gait. Holmes grabbed his coat. "Bring your revolver." We followed the figure through the morning fog, past the churchyard, and down to the marsh. Then it turned. Even now, I struggle to describe it. The figure was human, mostly. Its mouth was covered by cloth, but the eyes were wide, staring, gleaming with something between terror and ecstasy. It reached out a pale, trembling hand, and then vanished into the bog. Holmes exhaled slowly. "Watson, this case will not be solved with science alone." Section 2. The Whispering Marsh. The morning after our pursuit of the marsh figure found Holmes in rare form, animated, calculating, driven not only by intellectual curiosity but a gnawing sense of unease. The figure we had glimpsed was no simple madman, nor a superstitious peasant in disguise. Something deeper was at play. Holmes knew it, and so did I. We returned to the bog under better light, tracing the footprints the creature had left. Holmes knelt by a patch of flattened reeds. "Observe the stride," he murmured. "Too long for an injured man, and barefoot, but the impressions are deep. Heavy, yet not a single drop of blood. No torn skin, as though he felt nothing of the cold or the thorns." I crouched beside him. Could it be drug-induced? Some kind of ritual trance? Holmes didn't answer at once. Instead, he stood, brushed off his knees, and turned toward the village church. "Come. There's someone we must speak to." The parish sexton, a stooped man named Adam Greaves, had been caretaker of the chapel and its adjoining cemetery for over 30 years. He welcomed us warily, his eyes darting between us and the floor. "You've come about the crypt," he said before we could ask. Holmes inclined his head. "We understand the Talbot sarcophagus was disturbed. Were you the one to discover it?" "I," Greaves replied. "I do my rounds twice daily. Last Tuesday, I found the latch broken. The lid had shifted. Heavy stone, that one. Can't imagine how it moved. Could it have been done from within?" Holmes asked. Greaves blinked. "Pardon?" Holmes clarified. Was there any sign the stone had been pushed outward rather than lifted? The sexton paled. "You mean, from the inside?" Holmes didn't press the point. Instead, he requested we be allowed to inspect the crypt. We descended into the cold stone chamber beneath the church, where the air was thick with moisture and the scent of old dust. The Talbot memorial lay at the far end, a carved sarcophagus adorned with Egyptian symbols, including the Eye of Horus and the scarab. Holmes circled it slowly. "There," he pointed. "Scratches. Not from tools. From nails." I stared. Faint grooves marked the inner rim of the lid, trailing down the side. As though someone, or something, had tried to claw their way out. Holmes crouched beside the slab. "And this faint smear, iron oxide. Not blood, but rust. Which suggests chain or binding." I swallowed hard. "Do you believe someone was buried alive?" Holmes stood. "I believe someone wanted us to think so." Back at the inn, we found a letter waiting for Holmes. It was sealed with red wax and bore no return address. Inside was a single page, "Return the blade before Samhain, or the mute shall walk forever." Holmes read the note in silence, then handed it to me. "You see, Watson, this confirms it. There's more than archaeology here. There's ritual, ceremony, possibly a cult." "Samhain?" I asked. "That's the Gaelic festival, end of October. The veil between the living and dead, as they say." Holmes nodded. "And 4 days from now." We paid a second visit to the Talbot estate, this time searching the cellar. Holmes had deduced from the placement of dust and scratches upstairs that a hidden space lay beneath the eastern wing. After some effort, we discovered a panel behind a sagging bookshelf that opened to reveal a spiral stair descending into darkness. The air was cooler here, tinged with the earthy scent of centuries. We found ourselves in a stone chamber, no larger than a drawing room. The walls were covered in chalk symbols, ankhs, runes, Roman numerals, and strange hybrids. In the center stood a pedestal. On it, a book. Holmes approached it reverently. "The Codex Obscura," he whispered. I had heard of it, but never seen it. The book's pages were brittle, inked in a mixture of Greek, Coptic, and Egyptian glyphs. Holmes flipped through it, murmuring translations. "The one who wears silence shall open the gate. When the dagger is drawn, the breathless shall speak." He looked up. "Watson, I believe the mute figure we saw in the marsh is not merely deranged, he is part of a ritual. A ritual that begins, or ends, with that dagger." Holmes nodded. "Exactly. And there's more." He turned to the back of the book and showed me a crude map. A star-shaped symbol marked the bog, and beneath it, a note. "Here sleeps the one who knew Anubis." I asked, "Is it referring to a body? A priest?" Holmes's answer chilled me. "Or a vessel?" That night, the wind howled through the trees like wolves in mourning. The village lights flickered, and strange sounds echoed through the streets, distant chanting, a bell tolling without visible cause. Just before midnight, someone pounded on our door. It was Adam Greaves, the sexton. His face was pale, eyes wide. "You'd best come," he rasped. "The crypt." "It's been opened again." We rushed through the dark, lanterns in hand. The sarcophagus was ajar. But this time, something was missing. The glove. The one artifact returned with Talbot's effects. It had vanished. Holmes knelt where it had lain. "And now the ritual is in motion," he said quietly. "The mute walks. The glove is taken. The blade has been delivered. Only the scroll remains." Section 3. The man who spoke in dust by morning, the village of Abington was under a shroud heavier than mist, fear. Rumors of lights in the bog, of groaning beneath the church floor, even of Talbot himself returning from the dead spread faster than fire in dry straw. Holmes, unaffected by superstition but keenly aware of its effects, observed the townsfolk with his usual analytical detachment. "Terror," he muttered, "is the one contagion that requires no carrier." We returned to the Talbot estate to continue our investigation into the stolen glove, but Holmes was already focused on something else. "The scroll," he said. "If our adversaries have taken the dagger and now the glove, the scroll must be their next objective. But I do not believe it was ever brought back from Egypt. Then how do they intend to complete the ritual? Either they found a substitute, or they already have it, and Talbot lied." In pursuit of answers, we boarded a coach for Oxford University, specifically to the Bodleian Library, where Holmes believed Talbot might have deposited certain findings off record. We arrived mid-afternoon and were greeted by Dr. Edwin Hargrove, curator of antiquities and an old academic rival of Talbot's. "Talbot," he said, raising a skeptical brow. "A man of theatrical obsessions and poor documentation habits. He was convinced he'd found something called the Scroll of Lamhet, supposedly an oral liturgy predating written hieroglyphs. Is there any record of it?" Holmes asked. "Only a whisper. He submitted a translation attempt, a single page. Too fragmentary to publish. But I kept it. Out of morbid curiosity." He led us to a locked cabinet and retrieved a yellowed folio. Holmes unfolded the parchment. Written in Talbot's own hand, the scroll's text was disjointed, filled with ellipses and parenthetical clarifications. "When the throat of silence is opened, the unnamed shall listen, the three keys, the dagger, the hand, the tongue, he will rise on the night when veil and world are as one." Holmes traced the ink with his finger. "Not just a ritual. A resurrection." "Of what?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. "Or whom?" That evening, we returned to Abington to find the village in a state of unrest. Another break-in had occurred, this time at the old rectory, where Talbot's cousin, a reclusive invalid named Michael Bellamy, lived under near-total seclusion. We were greeted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Knorr, who trembled as she spoke. "He's gone," she whispered. The door was bolted from within. I found only the window open and his cane on the floor. We entered the home cautiously. The bedroom was empty. But in the dust near the hearth, Holmes found a set of overlapping footprints, barefoot, just like those from the marsh. "Bellamy wasn't taken," Holmes said. "He walked." "But he was crippled," I argued. "Could barely stand." "Yet he did." Holmes knelt by the hearth and picked up a folded page. Another scroll fragment. "When the last tongue is taken, the mouth will open again." I swallowed hard. "You think Bellamy was the tongue?" "I believe so." "Which means the other pieces." The blade and the hand were not merely symbolic, but literal. They are parts of a triune host. Then, someone, or something, is being reconstructed. Holmes nodded grimly. And the final stage begins on the night of Samhain. That night, the bog came alive. It began with wind, sharp, unnatural. Then a deep vibration, like the low thrumming of a cello across miles of damp earth. Holmes and I stood outside Talbot's home when we heard it. A voice. Low. Resonant. Not speech, not language, intonation. A note sustained beyond natural breath. We followed the sound to the marsh's center, where the earth rose slightly in a natural mound known locally as Dead Man's Hump. There, on its crown, stood three figures. One was the mute, the marsh walker. One was Bellamy, pale as a ghost, eyes vacant. And between them, a third. Wrapped in linen, face obscured, but tall. Too tall. Not walking, but floating, as though carried by the breath of the bog. Holmes hissed. "We're too late." They disappeared over the rise. By the time we reached the spot, they were gone, but the grass was blackened beneath their feet. Back at the inn, Holmes locked himself in his room. I heard the sounds of paper rustling, glass clinking, and the low, intense muttering he reserved for the most perilous puzzles. By morning, he emerged, pale and unslept. "There's a site," he said. "Older than the village. A druidic henge. Buried by peat centuries ago." "How do you know?" I triangulated the scroll's references to constellations and dates. "The ritual's locus lies under that mound, Dead Man's Hump. They've been preparing it for years." I asked the question I dreaded. "And the thing they're trying to raise?" Holmes stared at me. "Watson, they are attempting to reconstruct not a person, but a voice. A voice that predates scripture. One that should never be heard again." Section 4. Beneath the circle of stone we left the village behind before sunrise, following the misty outline of Dead Man's Hump across the frost-laced moors. The clouds had descended low, as though the sky itself was bracing for the terrible weight of the coming day. Holmes was armed only with the alabaster dagger, strapped to his side like a talisman. I carried my revolver, though I doubted bullets would serve against what we might encounter. As we reached the mound's crest, Holmes began sweeping the soil with a spade we'd taken from the sexton's shed. After half an hour, the blade struck stone. "Here," he said. "Help me clear it." Together, we uncovered a ring of sunken stones, moss-choked and cracked, but unmistakably artificial. A henge. The bog had swallowed it centuries ago, but it still pulsed faintly with that ancient wrongness we had felt in Talbot's cellar. A stone disc, perhaps 4 feet wide, rested in the center. Holmes knelt beside it and traced its surface with his fingers. "There's a mechanism," he muttered. "A dial. See the grooves? It rotates, like a vault. Do you think it leads below?" "I don't think. We must assume it." He grasped the stone's rim and twisted. It resisted, groaning like a waking beast. Then, with a shuddering click, it opened. The ground split to reveal a stairway spiraling into darkness. Holmes descended first, the dagger drawn and his lantern held high. I followed. The steps ended in a chamber, cold, circular, and lined with carvings. Unlike the Egyptian motifs of Talbot's artifacts, these were something older. Primal. The figures on the wall bore no recognizable faces, only open mouths. At the center of the room was a platform. On it, a body, or what remained of one. Wrapped in rotted linen. Hands folded. Lips sewn shut with ancient twine. Holmes approached carefully. "The host," he whispered. "What they built the ritual around. But it's dead." "No, Watson. It's waiting." He pointed to a niche in the wall, where a shallow depression bore the unmistakable shape of a dagger. That is where they intended to place the blade. To complete the act. Suddenly, a voice rang out behind us. "Don't move." We turned. A man stood at the top of the stairs, gaunt, hooded, and holding a pistol. His other hand held a cloth bundle. Holmes's face did not register surprise. "Dr. Julian Gray," he said evenly. The man stepped down into the light, revealing sunken eyes and a scholar's bearing. "I had hoped you'd be smarter than this, Holmes. But of course you had to see it." Gray, Talbot's former assistant. "Thought lost in the desert expedition." "You sent the dagger," Holmes said. "And the glove." "Why?" "To test you," Gray replied. "To ensure you'd follow. We needed a witness." He opened the cloth bundle. Inside was the scroll. Holmes stiffened. "You had it all along." Gray nodded. "Talbot was a fool. He feared what we found. But I listened." He crossed the chamber and held the scroll above the body. The voice was never meant to be silent. It was sealed in a vessel to prevent it from consuming the air around it. But tonight, we break that seal. Holmes lunged, but Gray was faster. He pressed the scroll into the corpse's chest and raised the pistol. "Stay back," he hissed. "You can't stop it. It's already begun." The corpse began to stir. A sound, low and harmonic, filled the room. The walls quivered. The body's mouth twitched. Threads snapped. Its jaw fell open. A sound emerged, not a scream, not speech, but a note that twisted the stomach and blurred the vision. I dropped to my knees. Holmes staggered. Gray, however, stood firm. "Yes," he said. "Yes." Holmes, through sheer will, pulled himself upright. He clutched the alabaster dagger and hurled it. The blade struck the scroll, piercing it through the corpse's chest. There was a flash of white, then silence. Gray collapsed. The corpse did not move again. We emerged from the mound an hour later, gasping, trembling. The wind had died. The mist was gone. The moor, once thick with dread, now felt strangely hollow. The scroll burned. The corpse returned to stillness. And Gray, unconscious, muttering syllables that formed no words. Holmes stood at the mound's edge, looking back. "It was not a god," he said. "It was not a demon. It was a resonance. A frequency so unnatural it became sentient. They thought it was a being, but it was only a sound. A pattern. And now it's gone." He didn't answer at first. Then, interrupted. "Suppressed. Perhaps forever." Epilogue to Section 4. 3 days later, Gray was remanded to Bedlam, incoherent and unreachable. The dagger, retrieved from the pit, was returned to the British Museum under heavy guard. And Holmes? He spent the following week in silence. No papers. No casework. Only his violin, playing a single, haunting melody over and over again. A melody I recognized, though I could not say from where. When I finally asked what it was, he replied simply, "Something I heard beneath the earth." Section 5. The refrain in the fire. 2 weeks passed in uneasy calm. Holmes resumed his typical habits, consulting on minor cases, reading obscure publications, and practicing the violin with methodical precision. Yet I noted subtle differences in his manner. He rose earlier. He paced more. And he played, always, in the same minor key. The melody he had heard in the chamber below Dead Man's Hump. It had imprinted itself upon him, like a memory refusing burial. One evening in November, a knock came at the door. A messenger, pale and winded, handed Holmes an envelope. The seal bore the insignia of the British Museum. He read the contents and looked up at me. "The dagger is missing." We arrived at the museum's antiquities department the next morning. Sir Alistair Cromley, head of security and a long-time admirer of Holmes, met us at the staff entrance. "It's vanished without a trace," he said as he led us through the empty marble halls. "No signs of forced entry. No evidence on the security reels. It was kept in a sealed display with a magnetic lock. Untouched until last night." Holmes examined the empty pedestal. "There's no residue. No scratches. Whoever took it understood the artifact." Cromley cleared his throat. "There is one thing. A staff member found this in the Egyptology reading room." He handed Holmes a torn scrap of vellum. Holmes turned it over. A single phrase was scrawled in faded ink: "I sang before time knew silence." Holmes went very still. Then, turning to me, said, "Watson, he's not finished. Grey. Not just grey. Something larger." This was never about the weapon, it was about the song. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes retrieved the fragments of Talbot's notes, the remaining scraps of the scroll of Lamhet, and his own transcriptions from the henge chamber. He spent the entire night collating them into a single document, a symphonic structure of meaning buried in metaphor. "What are you looking for?" I asked, sometime around dawn. "A refrain," he replied. "A recurrence. Rituals such as these are not linear. They echo. Like a canon. I need to find the next iteration." He stopped suddenly, tapping one corner of the parchment. "There. Where smoke eats starlight, and the first word was flame. That's not poetic metaphor. That's geography." "Where?" "Wales. The Black Valley." The Black Valley, or Cwm Du, lay buried in the wilds of northern Wales, a region feared for centuries and sparsely inhabited. Legend spoke of singing stones, disappearing children, and midnight lights with no source. We arrived on horseback, the only means of reaching the steep interior paths. A local guide, Ianto, refused to venture beyond the stone arch at the valley's entrance. "They say a language sleeps there," he said, crossing himself. "Do you mean the Welsh tongue?" I asked, trying to ease the tension. "No, sir. A deeper one." Holmes said nothing. We spent the night in a crumbling shepherd's hut deep within the valley. As the sun set, the hills around us took on unnatural silhouettes. Too symmetrical, as though cut by an unseen mason. At midnight, the wind began to hum. Not whistle, hum. Holmes opened his notebook. Listen closely. It's the same pitch we heard in the chamber. The vibration grew into a tone, a low harmonic that pressed behind the eyes. The flame in our lantern flickered sideways, not upward. Then the earth gave a sudden, subtle lurch. A stone nearby, large, rectangular, began to glow faintly. We approached it. Holmes touched the surface. Beneath his fingers, glyphs began to appear. Not carved, but revealed by some internal heat. The markings matched the scroll. It's a resonant key, he whispered. Not physical. Tonal. He opened his violin case and, to my astonishment, began to play the same refrain he had repeated every evening since the chamber. The stone pulsed, then split. A door yawned open beneath our feet. Inside was a chasm. No stair. Just a slope of black glass descending into the earth. Holmes didn't hesitate. I followed, albeit with my nerves knotted tight. We emerged in what can only be described as an amphitheater. Not Greek. Not Roman. But older. 7 tiers. 7 altars. And at the center, a column of black obsidian, atop which floated the dagger. Holmes breathed. It hovered inches above the stone, encased in a hum. Around us, figures began to appear. Human. Hooded. They emerged from the darkness one by one, silent, slow. Gray stood at their center. You followed the refrain, he said. Holmes stepped forward. You used me. No. You completed the phrase. The dagger needed a bearer. It needed memory. You remembered. Suddenly, the hum swelled. The walls of the chamber began to shimmer. Symbols flared with heat. Holmes turned to me. The dagger is not a weapon. It is a tuning fork. Gray smiled. And now, the final note. He raised his arms, and the figures around him began to chant. Not in any language I knew. Not words. Tones. Pitches that warbled and pulled at the edges of thought. The dagger pulsed. Holmes screamed. Shoot it, Watson! I fired at the obsidian column. It shattered, and the dagger dropped like lead. Silence. Gray collapsed. The figures froze. The chamber dimmed. Holmes retrieved the dagger and held it tightly. It's over, he said. For now. Section 6. What the wind forgets. We emerged from the Black Valley broken but breathing. Gray was taken into custody by local authorities. Silent, catatonic, the spark of fanaticism snuffed from his eyes. The others had vanished, like mist at dawn. Holmes said little during our return journey, and once back in London, he fell into a kind of withdrawn fugue, one I had seen only once before, after the Reichenbach Falls. The dagger was locked within a lead-lined box and delivered into the hands of Mycroft Holmes, who assured us it would be stored in a facility that specialized in containment rather than exhibition. Does that mean it's dangerous? I asked. Mycroft glanced at the box, then at Holmes. Let's say it's persuasive. Winter gripped the city in steel and smoke. Holmes spent most days at his desk, surrounded by fragments of the scroll, recovered chants, and pages of harmonic analysis. He no longer referred to it as the dagger case. Instead, he called it the resonance hypothesis. It's not the object, he explained one evening as we sat beside the fire. It's the pattern. The dagger merely happens to be the most coherent manifestation of it, a physical resonance tuned to awaken an auditory echo left in this world long before memory. Like a phonograph left playing in a cavern. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Precisely. Then came a letter. Written on heavy parchment. No return address. The script, however, was unmistakable, Benedict Talbot's hand. Mr. Holmes, they are digging again. Not in Egypt. In Wales. The voice you silenced was not the first. Nor the last. Come to Clackguire. Quickly. Talbot was dead. We had seen his memorial. Yet the handwriting was real. Holmes placed the letter down and said only, "It's a summons." Clackguire, a mining hamlet near the Welsh border, was a place forgotten by maps. The mountains pressed inward like great stone jaws, and the air was thin with cold. We arrived under pretense, a geological inquiry, as Holmes explained to the local constable. Yet word spread fast, and soon a gaunt man came to find us at the inn. His name was Evan. He claimed to be a descendant of the ancient bards, keepers of oral memory. They've broken into the Caer, he whispered. The singing place. It was sealed before the Romans. Where is it? Holmes asked. Evan shook his head. It's not where. It's when. The Caer moves. You must follow the wind. That night, the wind shifted violently, west to east, then back. Holmes listened from the window for hours before declaring, "Tomorrow, we climb." At first light, we ascended the ridge above Clackguire. Evan had marked a trail, but it soon disappeared into scree and ice. After 3 hours of treacherous footing, we reached a plateau. There, hidden behind a tumble of fallen stones, was a tunnel, carved by tools older than civilization. Holmes entered without hesitation. The tunnel bent in unnatural ways. Angles did not match their corners. The walls bore not carvings but impressions, as though sound itself had been etched into the rock. At its end was a door. Not of stone, but of iron laced with silver thread. Holmes placed his ear to it and smiled grimly. It's humming. He pressed his palm to the center. The door opened. We stepped into a room that was not a room. The air was dense, like honey. Our breath came out in vaporous spirals. Before us stood a choir of statues, 7, arranged in a crescent. Each bore a mouth wide open, and none had eyes. Holmes stepped toward them. They are the syllables, he whispered. The phonemes of the first phrase. Then came the sound. Slow. rising. It wasn't from the statues. It was from the air itself. Holmes clutched his ears. "They've started it without the dagger," he gasped. "They're trying to complete the phrase from memory. From sound alone." We turned. A group of figures emerged from the wall itself, as though called by resonance. Hooded. Chanting. One of them held a replica of the dagger, glass, not stone, but tuned the same way. Holmes stepped forward. "Stop! You do not know what you summon." One of the figures removed their hood. It was a child, or what had once been one. Its mouth had no lips, just a circle of raw, vibrating flesh. The chanting reached a crescendo. Holmes raised the real dagger. He had hidden it beneath his coat. He struck the air with it. A note rang out, clear, pure, and final. Everything stopped. The figures fell. The wind died. The statues cracked. And something in the wall screamed, not in sound, but in meaning. A shape of thought expelled. We left Clack-Guire in silence. Holmes never played the violin again. Section 7. The final phrase. Winter clung to London like a fogged glass, grey and impenetrable. It had been 3 weeks since Clack-Guire. Holmes, once animated even in silence, had withdrawn to a state of almost complete interiority. He no longer read the papers. He refused cases. The violin remained untouched on its stand. One evening, I found him by the hearth, staring into the flames as though listening to a voice that burned with the coals. "I believe," he said quietly, "we did not silence it." I said nothing. He continued, "Resonance is not defeated. It disperses. Like heat. Like memory. And some frequencies, Watson, return not in sound, but in thought." That night, Holmes awoke in a fit. His pulse raced. His eyes were wide but unseeing. "Do you hear it?" he asked me, fingers trembling. "In the walls? Beneath the glass?" "There's nothing, Holmes," I said, alarmed. But he was certain. "There's a final phrase. A closing chord. It remains unsung." The next day, a letter arrived. No seal. No signature. Only this: "You interrupted the call. But you did not cancel it. The choir waits." Beneath the vault where fire was born. Holmes's face paled. He folded the note with ritual care. "Watson," he said, "we must go to Scotland." 2 days later, we arrived at an isolated Highland outpost. Inverday. Once a Norse chapel, it had since become a ruin, forgotten by all save the mountain wind and the birds who dared nest in its hollow eaves. But Holmes had done his research. This, he said, was once known as Caer Glas. The glass fortress. It predated the monastery. It was a place of ritual, chant and flame. It is where they will gather to complete the phrase. "Who?" I asked. Holmes looked into the sky. "Those who remember it. We waited 2 nights in silence. Then, on the third, they came. Figures, silent, hooded, barefoot, emerged from the tree line. Not 50. Not 100. Dozens, maybe more. They did not speak. They did not look at us. They entered the ruin. Holmes stood. "This is the choir," he said. We followed. Within the stone remains, a circle had been traced, white chalk over ancient flagstones. Candles flickered in unnatural stillness. At the center, an altar of jet black glass. And on it, the dagger. Holmes froze. "That's impossible." "We left it with Mycroft," I said. He nodded grimly. "So either he has lied, or they have another." Then the sound began. One voice. Then 2. Then 7. Then many. Not melody. Not harmony. Just sustained, lead pitch, an overlapping hum that caused the floor to vibrate and the breath to hitch in the lungs. Holmes stepped forward. "If they finish the phrase, it opens the gate. Not to the dead. Not to gods. But to resonance unbound. To meaning that devours meaning." I grabbed his arm. "Then we must stop them." "No," Holmes whispered. "We must complete it." "What?" He met my eyes. "This pattern, Watson, it was never designed to be halted. Only fulfilled. The wrong frequency collapses thought. But the right one might contain it." He stepped into the circle. They did not stop him. He raised his voice, tuned it to the tones we'd studied in silence, in fire, in stone. The pitch shifted. The choir wavered. A crack raced across the altar. Holmes held the final note. And the glass exploded. When I came to, the ruin was empty. The dagger was dust. And Holmes lay still. But breathing. Epilogue: he recovered slowly. But not fully. The Holmes who returned to Baker Street was no longer the same man. He was softer in speech. Quieter. As though a part of him still listened for vibrations only he could hear. "I heard it, Watson," he told me one spring evening. The final phrase. It was beautiful. Terrible. And complete. He never spoke of the dagger again. But sometimes, when the wind howled through the chimney, I'd see his fingers twitch, measuring intervals only he could feel. Thus ended the case of the alabaster dagger. Not in justice. Not in reason. But in sound. A sound that waits, not in tomb or crypt, but in memory itself.